All right, we're ready to begin. My name is Leeza Osipenko. I head Consilium Scientific, and today we're hosting a panel of three investigative journalists who will share their experiences and reflect on the challenges of their profession and current environment in different countries. So I'm very pleased to welcome Serena Tinari, who is the co-founder of Recheck, a Swiss nonprofit organization for the investigation and mapping of health affairs. We're also being joined by Ariane Dinoel, who is a freelance French journalist, and she is lecturing at the University of Grenoble. And Ariane wrote a number of books, which you can find in our library. And we also have Jean Lenzer with us, who is an American journalist who published extensively in the BMJ, New York Times, Atlantic, many other famous journals and magazines, and wrote a book on Danger Within Us on medical devices. So I welcome our panel and look forward to insightful discussion. So we will start with introductions and positions from our speakers. And for our audience, feel free to put your questions or points in the chat. And if you would like to ask our panel a question, you can raise your hand and I will ask you to turn your camera and we'll bring you into the discussion. So let's begin. Serena, please introduce yourself.
Okay, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a great panel and opportunity. I am a medical investigative journalist based in Switzerland. I've been working for many years for the Swiss public broadcaster and authored dozens of long feature documentaries, mostly on drug safety and conflicts of interest in healthcare. In 2015, I co-founded Recheck, Investigating and Mapping Health Affairs. That's a non-profit to dig deeper in this field. I co-authored, on commission by the Global Investigative Journalism Network, a guide on investigating health and medicine, among other things, of course. At Recheck, we work at the crossroads between evidence-based medicine and investigative journalism. So we are into analyzing the best available evidence on all medical interventions and around conflicts of interest. We join collaborative projects that put together muckrakers and academics. I want to say that my life has changed pretty much with the COVID era because digging deeper on pharmaceutical companies' strategies to avoid accountability and potential harms of drugs and vaccines was most welcome before 2020. Then, all of a sudden, all that became controversial. Critical questions or the really basics in our field became strangely controversial. Even mentioning potential risks of a pharmaceutical product or of a public health policies became dangerous for a medical doctor, for an academic, and also for an investigative journalist specializing in this field. And that has been also leading to censorship and self-censorship. I want to state clearly the obvious. Each single pharmaceutical product comes with potential benefits, potential risks, and potential harms. That's how it works. And that's why each product must be tested and approved. It's like saying that all antibiotics are all safe and effective. Actually, each of them is a single specific product. And if I say that, am I suddenly a anti-antibiotics? In this field, it's never one size fits all. As we well know in this room, I believe, I am in great company today, health and medicine, healthcare, it's a system that comes with many dysfunctions. And that's why we need regulatory authorities that do the work properly. We need well-designed clinical trials. And after all, that's why we need healthcare investigative journalism. So I advocate for the end of censorship, of the end of self-censorship, and for an honest, open conversation in the society and in academia as well on these really important topics, from conflicts of interest to improving safety to making medicine as much as possible in the public interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Serena. Ariane, please take the
Yes,
floor.
thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Consilium, for inviting me to. So I became a freelance journalist because I lost my job because of an article on adverse events. I was deputy chief editor of a Belgian news magazine at the time when Gardasil and Cervarix came out. I had heard they could trigger adverse events, but the journalist in charge of health topics would not cover them. So she was one of these people who think a vaccine can only be good and people should be encouraged to take as many vaccines as possible. So I asked a freelancer to investigate, and I wrote an accompanying piece on other vaccines' adverse events, telling stories of parents whose children had suffered serious adverse events from common childhood vaccines. And then all hell broke loose when the article came out. And with hindsight, I realized I was very naive. The media group I was working for had a whole division dedicated to print magazines for health professionals in French and in Dutch, as is usual in Belgium. So the GP, the physiotherapist, etc. The industry, threatened to threatened the shareholders. It was a Flemish family to take their €700,000 yearly ad budget somewhere else. So to cut a long story short, they tried to harass me into quitting. I sued them. The judge ordered them to follow the rules in sacking me. Then as a retaliation, they fired my husband, who was unfortunately working for the same company. So we moved back to France and started from scratch. I started teaching at the university, and it's a part-time contract. And as Serena, I see that as a freelance journalist, it gets harder and harder to get articles critical of drugs and pharma published in general. And it's been so much worse since COVID. I totally agree with Serena. Publishing books is a way around it in a way, but you generally can't make a living out of them, in my experience at least. Plus, other journalists tend not to cover books depicting how deeply dysfunctional health services have become and how much corruption in science is shaping the way we see drugs. So they tend to stay off radar in my experience. Plus, in France, as you maybe know, a lot of print, web, TV, and radio media belong to billionaires who are mostly willing to defend corporate interests and more generally to remain on, say, friendly terms with the powers that be. Their media do less and less investigation. And as for public-owned media, they remain strong in radio and TV, but they have become less open to these topics since COVID too. And their motto seems to have become something along the lines of, we must not deter people from getting treatment, from seeking help. I get that all the time. I hear it all the time. And as a kind of conclusion, I would say there's a small glimmer of hope in that NGO-like organizations are financing investigations and broadcasting them through their own, often international networks. I'm starting to work with one. It's called Disclose. It's in France, but they are not used to health topics at all, and they are very scared of them. And they know once they get dubbed conspiracy theorists, they're as good as dead. So it's moving very slowly. And all in all, I would say the outlook is not bright.
Okay, thank you very much. When you were starting to tell your story, I was like, are you sure you didn't work in the US? But then now we'll hear the US side of the story. So Jean, please go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you, Lisa, and I'm amazed, Serena and Ariane. Wonderful to be here together with you. And all I'm doing is thinking as we talk how we're going to do a project together, all of us, because it's so necessary. I was fortunate enough to work with Serena on two projects. One was with ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists on Medical Devices. And then again, we've worked on a list of industry independent experts. And this is what I want to say to any journalists who are listening in, that one of the most important things you can do in reporting is have people who aren't on the payroll of industry, experts you can turn to for good advice when you're reporting. I'm interested in the project I've been working on for the last 2 years is a deep dive investigation into how FDA approves drugs. So what we did is we created a database of all new drugs that have been approved by the FDA over the last 10 years. And our findings are absolutely dumbfounding. I'll give one little tease. I can't give away all the statistics yet. They will be published shortly by The Lever, which is an investigative outlet that did a lot on how corruption has been legalized in the United States, that everything you would think would be illegal has actually been made legal. And this has impacted drug approvals enormously. And one thing we found were quite a few cancer drugs that have been approved. Well, I'll back up. I'm sorry. So when we looked at the last 10 years and all new drug approvals, the way we assessed them in our database was to look at the 4 criteria that the FDA itself says is central to establishing whether a drug works or not. It's not the be all and end all, but it is their very baseline minimum. And one of the baseline minimums is that you have to have a control group. I mean, if you don't have a control, if you don't compare one group to another, how do you know whether you're doing any good? So cancer doctors can say, I've got a drug and it's going to help you live longer. And you say, well, gee, would I have lived longer without the drug? Would I have lived longer with a different drug? The only way you know the answer to that is if there is a control group, a comparison group that's the same as the group that got the experimental drug. And we found that of the 4 basic criteria, was there a control group? Was there replication? A cornerstone of science. There is no science without replication. Was it blinded? Very important to not having biasing. And finally, was there a clinical outcome or did they use a surrogate? Because surrogates fail. What a surrogate is a laboratory value or an imaging test. So you tell somebody, well, gee, I got rid of your virus. Your viral count is very low now. But the drug actually killed people because it killed their liver or it killed their red blood cells. So we looked at those 4 criteria to see how often the companies provided evidence to the FDA that they had done appropriate kinds of clinical trials. The numbers we're going to publish will make people's jaws drop. You just won't believe it. But for quite a few cancer drugs, we found that the drugs were approved without meeting one single one of those criteria. No blinding, no control arm, no replication, and a surrogate outcome. I'm gobsmacked.
Thank you for these illustrative introductions. And my first question would be on the infrastructure, if it's the right term. So being an investigative journalist was never easy, but I'd like to learn from you, what were the issues before COVID in terms of censorship? What was making life difficult? Lack of funding was probably all over the place and is now, but as you say, it's becoming more impossible. So who picked up the game? What is this pharma that is blocking it? Is this financial institutions? Is this regulators? Who is making life even more difficult? So your insights for before and after, and I wonder if it's the same across the board, or maybe it's different in France or different in Switzerland or Italy or in the US. So who would like to go first?
Serena, I nominate you to go first.
Thank you. I mean, I'm a fan, so whatever you say, I come, I follow. Well, I think it's, I mean, your question would require probably 12 hours to be addressed. In my experience, let's say before COVID, when I was working for Swiss public broadcaster, I didn't have a financial problem, a funding problem. Besides convincing your editor-in-chief, the main issue I was confronted with was basically the pressure from pharmaceutical companies that were maybe the object of my investigation. And usually that came in the shape of indirect pressure. Like they were trying to put you in trouble. the mud machine. So they were trying to imply that maybe your reporting was not accurate. Are you really sure? So that would have, I remember one specific case, two actually. One was about Gardasil that my colleague has mentioned before, and the other one was about so-called modern third, fourth, fifth generation birth control pill, where I was really put in a corner, and my editor-in-chief of the time at one point decided to delay the broadcasting, and they asked me to reconsider the whole investigation. So it was really like a pressure machine that can make your life quite miserable. I believe burnout in this line of work, it's a thing. Then in any case, I think one of the aspects that for us I think is quite clear, but for people out there maybe not always, is that the influence of follow the money, it's very complex. It's not only that the doctor is paid or that the industry has so much power and there is a lot of lobby power. It's the whole system that is quite corrupted. Just to give you one basic example, medical doctors do continual medical education. That's mandatory to work as a doctor. That CME is usually paid by the industry because the medical society are sponsored by the industry. And then you have, as a teacher, maybe you are an experienced doctor, but you still have to do it. You have so-called key opinion leaders. They work at the same time for the industry and public health authorities. And then you have in front of you a good scientist, a researcher that wants to investigate a cancer drug. Who's paying for that study? And when he works, usually he works maybe in a clinic, in a hospital. Where is that clinic getting the money from to make research? It's again the industry. So it's a very complex system where there is a lot of so-called ghost management, things you don't see, but as soon you dig deeper, you see them all. And it's a bit of a maze, is a trap. And this ends up to Congress in the USA or in any national parliament. Our MPs are given by lobbyists the text of what they are supposed to say at the parliament session when, say, the question is, shall we pay for mammography screening for breast cancer? Shall we lower the age of women being called to be checked with the mammography screening? Shall we pay for that vaccine for the whole population? So that's, I believe, is the biggest issue after all. That is a system that is pretty trapped.
Any comments from Janet or Rian?
Yes, a few things. If my story proves something, it's that vaccines are slightly different from drugs in general, in that it has always been harder to criticize vaccine than drugs in general. And since COVID, it has become even worse. So I'm often in a position where I choose not to tackle vaccine topics because it's just impossible. It's people just won't hear about it. It's really crazy. And as for what you both described, which is the ghost management Serena talked about, and how dysfunctional, deeply dysfunctional the whole system is. I think ghost management is real and the whole process is rotten. But when you start describing that to people who are not aware of it, it does sound like a conspiracy theory. And then you stop. And then people tell you, well, but you can't say that because some people will lose confidence in science. It's very serious. You can't do that. But the problem, so I always try to say, the problem is the lack of transparency. And this very lack of transparency is creating conspiracy theories and not the opposite. And I'm always in a situation to try to explain that. And it's getting harder. This is the bottom line to me.
Let me ask you this question. Sorry, Serena, please feel free to respond. Yes.
Yeah, because I mean, we are also a bit into the struggles, and we touched a bit also the issue of the funding of investigative medical journalism. Maybe I would like to mention also, because since 2015, I'm not anymore an employee, a reporter with Swiss public broadcaster. And that is where it gets really hard to find money for in-depth investigations, because as we all know in this room, it takes time, it takes energy, you need time, and nobody wants to pay for that. Because as a freelancer, if you sell one article, well, the fee is really moderate. Even if you collaborate with, let's say, the British Medical Journal, might sound super prestigious, but frankly, the fee is ridiculous. I mean, it's something you just can't meet ends with. And then try and get some grants. Usually they have, because I mean, at Recheck, since years, we try to see how can we finance our work. And then when you find some specific grants for medical investigative journalism, very often, to not say always, behind that, there is a firewall maybe, but there is always money that comes either from, let's say, Pfizer Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I mean, you find any way behind it, there is money that comes with conflicts of interest. So how do you work here? And then I just wanted to add a little line to what Ariane said, science. What is science? Because the COVID era brought to the big public this weird, bizarre idea that science is like a Moloch, is a building, science is settled. That's not how it works. So you end up being in a very bizarre place that when you raise your hand and say, excuse me, science is not settled. Almost never, actually. In the history of modern medicine, we have so many brilliant examples of things that look so good. There were Nobel Prize given to people. I mean, one that comes to my mind is the electroshock for psychiatric issues. Well, we know by now that that's not a good idea. We don't do that anymore, but it looked like it was a brilliant idea. So there is also this, I believe, this disconnection between the reality of also of our work and what people is taught to. I mean, they have then strange ideas. And as Ariane said, even if you say very reasonable things, the basics, you end up being looked at, are you actually a conspiracy theorist? I'm not. I work with evidence-based medicine, guys. Come on. No, you have to just shut up and then maybe avoid topics that might be difficult. But this is not in the public interest.
So, Jean, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to echo both Serena and Ariane about vaccines in particular. When I was following the COVID vaccine, well, first of all, for our project on the FDA database, we have 14 nationally recognized advisors who we've worked with and 4 database experts who have analyzed the data. And back when I was looking at it's very straightforward with the drugs, as we talked about with the 4 criteria, but with vaccines, if you even ask the question, it's true. It's almost, you're instantly labeled an anti-vaxxer. And when I first raised questions about the Gardasil vaccine, I wrote in my articles, you know, I took well, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. COVID, I took the vaccines. But I did raise questions because one of our experts on our advisory panel, who specializes in epidemiology and research, said that they had cut off the final part of the testing because everybody was so anxious to get a vaccine. So they stopped the testing early. And we all know that statistically, you are more likely to get a false positive result when you cut off the results early. And when I asked the FDA why they cut off the study, why they cut it short, their answer was that industry said it would be, and this is the exact quote, it would be onerous for them to continue the study. It would be onerous. All they had to do was complete it, and we could have had an answer that I would have trusted and felt good about. Now, when people ask me, does it work? I say, I have no idea. I haven't followed it since, so I don't know what the outcome was finally. But our advisor said there would have been a simple way if they were anxious to get to the drug to people, the vaccine to people, they could have done a crossover study. And they chose not to do it because industry said it'd be onerous. The other thing is Serena was talking about in getting funding. We got funding for this project from a couple sources, but the first publisher really got cold feet. Their fact checkers decided to do their own research, I guess, in checking our research. And they decided, because they read the mainstream media, that we were wrong and mainstream was right. They really don't understand how you can claim in the Journal of the American Medical Association this drug works when the evidence actually says it doesn't work. And that happens where the actual data in the article itself is contradicted by their conclusion. So there's not only contradictory studies, there's contradictions even in the abstract versus what their data shows. And that was a study done by John Ioannidis that showed that. And then we went to another publisher. These were major. The second one was a huge, major outlet, would have been great for us to publish with. The day of publication, they killed the story. They felt that we were, quote, too prosecutorial. We were citing facts, data. You know, it's a very difficult thing now to publish like this. So I'm very grateful to the Lever. Shout out to the Lever.
Let me ask you this question. If this panel were to happen in 1980s, we would have to fly to some place, meet together, and hopefully get a whole of people, maybe 30, maybe for like 300, but we probably wouldn't even be able to record it. We wouldn't probably think about it. We wouldn't put it online. And if you were doing your job, you would be sending a typed up manuscript by actual post to some journal, magazine, or newspaper saying, hey, I wrote this investigation, can you please publish it? So now we are in a very different world where all of us can, at the click of a button, make any story public. We can have this event without prosecution, hopefully. We have, so we got new tools, which we couldn't even dream about some years ago. However, what I hear from you, the world has become even more closed, even more difficult. And it's a separate story for funding of investigative journalism studies, which are very expensive. That's a problem of its own right, and we can talk about it and who should be funding this work. So what are your comments on that? And I do have my own views, because obviously we have Consilium content that we try to promote. It's extremely hard because we don't sell kittens or porn or anything that sells very hotly. But how come these new technologies haven't made life easier for investigative journalists? Or have they?
It has in ways made it easier. And in fact, what I was thinking is, as soon as this is over, I really want to connect with the four of us and talk about undertaking a major international project. I think it's really important because these clinical trials are conducted all over the world. US clinical trials that come out for FDA, most of the time, most of the patients are actually in other countries. And then other countries, a number of them have told us that they have taken the point of view that if the FDA approves a drug, they just approve it automatically in their country. Now doctors are learning they can't trust the FDA so much, and that's just beginning to shift. And I would like to see us cross all these national boundaries and do a project on drugs like we did on medical devices.
Yes, and it would be interesting maybe to compare a regulator from another, because I personally am often faced with opacity, and in terms of FOIA, for instance, it gets harder and harder to get information which is supposed to be public from, among other regulators, from the EMA. And I've had to sue the French regulator to get information on adverse events on SSRIs. So it's taken me months, and it should be a public file. I mean, of course, it's anonymized, but it should be public all the same. So this is another thing maybe that we need to tackle, because I think the problem is getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
I might,
Actually, go ahead, Serena.
you know,
Yes.
like in terms of, because I mean, I believe it's quite clear that, let's say, the legacy media or mainstream media, they are in a deep crisis. I mean, that's a bit global. I mean, they struggle in selling paper copies, they struggle in getting subscriptions. And frankly, myself, with over 30 years in the business, honestly, I stopped reading most of the mainstream media because they get so much on my nerves, especially with all they publish in our field. You know, I'm like, no, come on, give me a break. And we have seen the appearing and now flourishing, actually, also the COVID era there maybe helps a bit. I mean, there is a lot of Substack, you know, what in the early days was the blogging, and now there is a lot of this self-publishing. And me personally, I do really prefer to pay $100 per year to a single investigative journalist to read his or her content. So this is a thing, of course, but there is still one question that I think has not been resolved: how to reach a really wide audience, because after all, that's about reaching out to people. So there, I believe there is still something that is not yet mature, is not yet real, but that's coming. Because I mean, I don't know, I think it's a bit global, that the classic media model, business model doesn't work anymore. The content is always the same, again, copy pasting bad content. Then in the COVID era, we had this weird, bizarre story of the fact checkers, which for me again was absolutely shocking, because I believe, maybe I'm old fashioned, but fact checking is the very basic of a journalist work. You fact check that you have the facts straight, the numbers, I mean, the facts has to be straight, right? And we have, I mean, supposedly in a newsroom, you will have an editor-in-chief, you have someone doing a line-by-line checking, I don't know. But suddenly there was this strange, weird new thing. Don't get me wrong, I also worked, for instance, for the guide of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. We had, at the end of the long editing process, we had a professional fact checker. I loved her because she went really line by line. And you know, there is always the possibility of mistake. And she found some stuff that we were really like, wow, that's amazing. Because stuff that you have been repeating maybe for 20 years, you know, you always put it in your PowerPoint presentation, you're sure, you know, it's like this cognitive tunneling. So that was a good thing. But what we have seen was completely different. And that came together with this weird stuff that was the social media putting the label, the World Health Organization and the regulatory agencies, they do always a great job, and all the vaccines are safe and effective. And that was very confusing. I published on the British Medical Journal an investigative piece about the so-called EMA leaks. That was a very interesting story. It was original material from the early discussions of the regulators, Canada, US, European countries. They were not sure how to assess the new mRNA platform. So, I mean, it was, and then the BMJ is really painful in the editing, you know, so it took forever. And then this gets published on the British Medical Journal, come on. And then a doctor that we know, Jean, published it on Facebook. And then he got the label. All the vaccines are safe and effective. So these are all symptoms, coming to your question, how the world has changed, how the digital world offers opportunities, but also risks and harms.
Fascinating, but one storyline which is as clear as always been, whoever has the money has the story. So, and doesn't matter the new techniques, they can pay for better algorithms, they can pay for the story they want to be in a public domain. So, but I also think one very important issue is coming out is actually people's awareness. So most people, even with money, who choose what they will fund, who they will fund, for what they will fund them, are I think if you just bring great amount of funders and start giving them the stories that you're investigating, most of them won't believe that. Most of them just won't even say this cannot be. No, that's not what it is. And I think this whole idea of education is very important. And of course, now the whole issue of conspiracy theory, which becomes equated with questioning. Just any question you ask, you are a conspiranoid agent of someone. So that becomes extremely difficult to bring this forward. So we do have quite a few questions in the chat, but before I get to them, I'd like to give a word to Ariane to tell us to give us a history lesson, basically. So about the mediator drug and what happened with that story. It was very well known in France and not as well known for the rest of them. Maybe for many of you online, it'll be the first time you hear about that. But I think it's a very important story, especially in light of current domination of very similar drugs, such as Ozempic, Wegovy, and the likes, GLP-1s. So, Ariane, we can keep it short, but I think just giving an illustration is very important, and an example what can await us with the new drugs.
Sure. So mediator was a kind of fen-phen drug. So it was an anti-diabetic, but it was sold for weight loss. And it created a major scandal. There was a whistleblower who was a pneumologist, Irène Frachon, and it took her about 10 years to have the regulators acknowledge that it was a very dangerous drug, and she wrote a book about it, which the manufacturer Servier tried to have tried to make unavailable to the public. And so it ended up with a big trial, and Servier was, they had to pay a fine, and also the French regulator for not protecting the public. And everyone in France knows about Irène Frachon. She's now the whistleblower of all whistleblowers, and she deserves it. But obviously, I'm kind of flabbergasted that in most other countries, maybe not Switzerland because there's a French-speaking part too, but people haven't heard about the mediator scandal at all. So that's that. Now it's forbidden, of course, but still, it remained on the market, and it supposedly killed about 2,000 people and maimed quite a lot of others too.
So do you think there are lessons in terms of transparency and reporting that need to be learned for the current uptake of the new GLP-1 drugs?
Well, of course, I can see that it's being really promoted very heavily and through all channels. So, and obviously seems to have the manufacturers seem to have hidden quite some dangers of the drugs, like some adverse events. So probably there is, but the striking thing is, after all that in the trial in Mediator, Irène Frachon said that the conflict of interest remains the rule in everything regarding drugs. So she herself does not believe that even a major scandal like that, which led to a kind of Sunshine Act in France, but it hasn't changed anything actually. That's what she says. So I'm not very hopeful.
Interesting you note the Sunshine Act, because there were quite a few comments in the chat about this, and it was a specific question to Jean whether it was useful for your work, basically looking at the payments that doctors have been receiving in the US?
Yeah. There are limitations. So it's useful in terms of helping people understand why we see biased results. But in terms of changing anything, it actually can have a totally counter effect. And that's been shown in some studies in two different ways. There was one study that looked at doctors who divulged their financial conflicts to patients, and they found that patients actually trusted them more. What they had to say, they trusted even more because they felt these doctors were therefore honest. And when they looked at what doctors who get money from industry say in their lectures, they found that they were, even when they were asked to reveal their conflicts, they were actually more likely to enhance their findings. It's the exact opposite of what you'd think. You'd think that maybe if they have to reveal their conflicts, they're going to be very careful and not overstate things. But when they asked these doctors why they overstated and exaggerated the benefits of the drugs, downplayed the harms, why they did that, they said, well, because the patients knew I had a financial conflict, I felt like I had to overcome that distrust. So, I made it bigger. There's another issue, and that was really played out with the new Alzheimer's drugs. And that is that doctors will often say, I have no financial conflicts. Well, they're getting money from a ton of drug companies. It's just that they didn't get the money from that company for that drug at that time. But there was a wonderful study by Stelfox on calcium channel blockers. And what they found was that doctors who worked for the manufacturer of the specific calcium channel blocker that was being studied were much more likely to write favorable outcomes. Their conclusions were very favorable for the drug. But interestingly, compared to doctors who got no money from a drug company and compared to doctors who got money from adjacent manufacturers, in other words, manufacturers of other calcium channel blocker drugs, far from actually, again, you would think that the manufacturer of a different calcium channel blocker would be likely to diss the first calcium channel blocker. No. They were actually more positive than the doctors who got no money. It was a dramatic difference. And what's happening is, as a new drug comes out, and there's a class effect. So a drug that attacks amyloid for the Alzheimer's drugs, for example, everybody thinks, oh, well, that guy was getting money from this other drug maker, not for lecanemab, not for aducanumab. And it turns out that they actually all supported each other, because if you throw down on the first one because it's lousy at its class effect of amyloid, then you risk the same problem. And that actually played out in a very vivid way when I attended the International Conference on Alzheimer's drugs. And these guys who were from different companies, it was Biogen, Eli Lilly, and I'm forgetting Eisai, those three companies, these guys were slapping each other on the back, literally, about their successes with these drugs that were killing people and having horrid side effects.
Yeah, interestingly, one of these drugs is going to be relooked at by NICE because they didn't receive reimbursement, but the story is not over yet. So let's keep following the money rather than science. So my question to all of you is, who do you think is well positioned today to support investigative journalism and to support funding, either financially or ideologically, but hopefully both? Or it's the niche is vacant? Who would you like to get money from, or who would you take money from?
Listen to this silence.
The people.
Okay, that's a very good answer, because that was my thinking as well. If crowdfunding is the answer, because there are people who were harmed by the industry, and it's also dangerous because obviously when people are harmed, they might take a very ultra position rather than the balanced and scientific view of things. They might take a very emotional view. So, but on the other hand, there's important to educate the public about the other side of the story. And it looks like that field is completely vacant. So very little of that is happening. Well, I wouldn't say completely vacant, because yes, we do have fantastic publications on Subtrack and then some posts in social media and somewhere, but once again, the ability to reach out to the wider audience is extremely limited. So from that perspective, what steps do you think need to be taken to get this field on its feet, to give it enough backing? What would you like to happen if
You know,
if
I'm sorry to raise it again and again, the COVID era, but there I felt like we had a lot of retropedaling, because suddenly the vast majority of people worldwide, because I've been analyzing it, or recheck, we have been analyzing it a lot, and there were so many same messaging, same narratives, same headlines, same statements, was really a bit creepy, I dare to say. But at one point, people were, I mean, everyone was told there is the science, everything is perfect. Trust me, I'm a doctor, which sounds really like a TV ad, direct to consumer of a prescription drug. So there was a moment that I really felt like, come on, we have been digging out so many stories that show that reality is way more complicated than that. And people know it, by the way. I frankly, personally, I get really unnerved when I see the people being treated like patronizing. They are stupid. They don't understand. That's not true. I always said, also as a TV journalist, I always said, we can't treat people like they are stupid. They are not stupid. But then I believe now there is also a bit of a counter thing, because I believe that many people, especially in some countries, they really didn't have a choice. I mean, some people that maybe they thought, I might not get this specific vaccine, but if they wanted to keep their job, they had to. Or if they wanted to be able to see the grandmother or bring the children to the kindergarten, they had to. And then I feel that it takes a lot of time. But some people now kind of lost trust, which might be a good thing on one hand, because I mean, the blind trust in this moloch of the science, public health, my doctor with a white coat, I don't believe is really healthy, because you would need a more differentiated and critical approach. And yet, from day one, we wrote and we said that's dangerous, because once people lose the trust in public health and medicine and so forth, well, this can get dangerous, because there are some medical interventions that might be really needed and necessary. And yet then we lost quite some people, because they say, oh, you won't get me there again. I got it now. So I think it's a very difficult situation when you speak about educating the people. Yes, of course, as I put myself in that pot too. When I started working in this field, I wasn't an expert. I learned so much, and it was very eye-opening, right? Starting from my own health or my family health. Now I have quite some strong opinions. Do we do this or not? For instance, there is this magic of like waiting, not doing anything. In evidence-based medicine, we know it, that sometimes it's better you wait. You don't run to the hospital if you have a fever, right? A temperature. You take like the home remedies and you will survive eventually, probably, not always. So I think we need a lot to find again also a culture of common sense, also in medicine, that helps us also protect ourselves and the people from the excess of medicine and the conflicts of interest. Because I think the three of us in this room, we have seen so many cases that you start to be very, very careful with this.
But it's very interesting to consider where the public opinion is and which side they're on. And I don't know how accurate the statistics are, but it's been communicated for years that the view of pharmaceutical industry by the public is either mixed or poor, and approval ratings are under 35%. So it's not like you have public standing by pharmaceutical industry. On the other hand, maybe it just doesn't matter because in the end, they have the money, they buy the opinion that they want. So, but also I wonder what is Jan's opinion is on in terms of approval of the US healthcare system, because even those of us who have very good insurance and theoretically can go to the doctor and get decent quality service right away. And needless to say that there is a lot of good in the hospital that you can find, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a disaster for uninsured patients, and it's a disaster for just the cost of healthcare and how many even well-to-do people can go bankrupt. So what is the approval of the healthcare system? And it's just where's the mood of people? And I'm trying to find where the support for truth can come from to resolve this. And of course, I have to drop that one on and let you comment on all of this. Whether you think the new technologies can be a solution, or another impediment, or nothing will change just because, well, we got email and we got the web and we can publish, but like you brought examples that it came with positives and negatives. So on that note, I'd love to hear your opinions before we wrap up.
Well, just weaving back a little bit to what patients believe and trust. I mean, a lot of it comes from physicians. It's driven by physicians. For example, the belief that you've got Alzheimer's drugs that can now help you, and that everything is driven by industry also drives which questions are asked. And that's a big problem. We don't address what you could do to help people with Alzheimer's, which, you know, having carers and having better access to carers and exercise, all those things that could really make a difference. Instead, the money goes to researching drugs. And as for their distrust of pharmaceutical companies, yes, they distrust them, but largely based on money, on the extreme amounts of money that they're charging, and really don't necessarily understand that the drugs don't work. And to what Serena said, you know, about some drugs really being valuable, I mean, when Shannon, my colleague, and I, Shannon Brownlee, write about the bad drugs are getting approved by the FDA, one of the comments we hear from doctors over and over who finally are having, you know, the wool lifted from their eyes and saying, oh my goodness, I didn't realize how bad it was. I didn't realize these drugs perform so poorly. And their reaction is, I don't know what to trust. I'm afraid of what prescription to write. And that's the big problem. That's why I do this, because there are some really good life-saving drugs and interventions, and we can't tell which is which because we can't trust our regulators. As for healthcare, what a shame. You know, we're the one country that refuses to have a national healthcare system or fully insured people. And you know, Trump said he was going to make sure that everyone had health insurance. And when someone asked him, I think it was 1 or 2 years ago, who was going to fund it, he said the government. So supposedly he was supporting socialized medicine, except what happened? They're cutting Medicare, cutting Medicaid, and people are just in terrible circumstances here. So poor people get undertreated and rich people get overtreated. And they're both dangerous, both ends.
Thank you. Ariane?
I would say new technologies or old technologies. It's more to me a problem of the path we have to find now between the major outlets who mostly say all is well, don't worry, and the conspiracy theorists who say everything is rotten, don't trust anything, and some outlets who say they own the science TM, you know, and we have to find a path to just sort of allow debate, because there's no more debate. And maybe I think most people are aware of this, you know, the lay people, you talk to them and they do think that people, they're in silos. So you have the major outlet silo and you have the conspiracy theorist silo, and they never communicate. It's like two parallel universes. So maybe the path we should take is open debate and ask questions and say it would need to carry on asking questions, and we need more transparency.
Thank you. Serena, any final words?
No, I mean, I just want to say thank you, because this was really interesting. And I find quite interesting as well that the three of us, we are different, of course, but there are some pretty many common lines, and this probably rings a bell, right? We come from different countries, we work in very different ways probably, but there are some lines that unfortunately they keep repeating themselves. And I mean, I really wish that some improvements could be made, especially as you mentioned, in letting people know these things that we know. I mean, it's not something that only the elite should know about, right? Because I mean, health and medicine, they touch everyone. I mean, every people should have really the right to transparency and the fair information, and then you take your own decision. And that's why we work a lot with evidence-based medicine, because there the wish and the need of the patient is one of the pillar. Everyone deserves to have information, full information.
Thank you so much for incredible work you've done so far, for great work you will be doing, hopefully with the help of new tools which can make it easier. But we're yet to see, because obviously it's a two-sided coin. But it is very sad to hear that the world has gotten worse, in a sense, for investigative journalism, and the plots are drying out even from what they were. On the positive side, I think the whole idea of media, the whole idea of journals, the whole idea of bringing content to the users is about to change dramatically. It has been changing a lot, but it might be unrecognizable within 5 years. And maybe this brings hope. The only thing which is kind of holds permanently is the money rule, the storyline. And if the objective is to find a way around it, and there might be a solution, hopefully we find that way forward, and bring the relevant information to more people, and to figure out how in this new digital world to bring the facts to the surface, because AI can do a lot of things for us, but while we're still human and not cyborgs, we still have to take care of our bodies and to take care of our health, and solutions are not there yet, so there are a lot of risks. So thank you so much for joining today, and I look forward to working with you in the future, and thank you for enlightening our audience. So have a good afternoon, everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.